Hello, everyone, and welcome to Maximising Outcomes with Blended Learning, Present and Future Strategies for Taking a Student-Centred Approach. This is a Times Higher Education webinar in partnership with Adobe. My name is Alistair Lawrence. I'm the Special Projects Editor at THE, and I'll be chairing today's discussion, where I'll be joined by a panel of experts from academia and industry who are Mark Andrews, Strategic Development Manager at Adobe, Claire Lucas, Professor of Engineering, Teaching and Learning, King's College London, Laurie Phipps, Senior Research Lead at JISC, and Anne Thanaraj, Assistant Academic Registrar for Digital Transformation at Teesside University. I'd like to begin by noting that there will be an opportunity to put questions to the panel during the final 5 or 10 minutes of the hour that we've got scheduled today. So please feel free to write any questions in the Zoom box and we'll answer as many as possible before the end of the webinar. To begin to frame the discussion, I'd like to note that blended learning is now a critical component of how universities manage the modern student journey. There are many strategic challenges about its implementation and delivery still ongoing, and this webinar is an attempt to bring together a panel of experts from industry and academia to exchange knowledge and best practice that will hopefully help you and, as I say, answer any questions that you may have. So to begin, I'd like to ask the panel what teaching experiences during the past 18 months can inform future blended learning programs, or perhaps ones that they've implemented already. Claire, can we come to you to start, please?
Yes, so thanks for having me. The past 18 months obviously have been a good time of learning for us and acceleration of our practice. And as an engineering person, I think the biggest aspect has been in terms of labs. So this is something I've talked about before. How do we do blended learning in terms of our practical activities that we need to do as engineers? And we've had a lot of success with things like lab at home kits, not because of the teaching content changing or anything like that, but what we've discovered, which I think is scalable to other aspects of blended learning, is that students having more time to work on scaffolded activities in their own time encourages and increases learning gain. So what I mean by that is, rather than them rushing out of a lab session at the end of a couple of hours that we've put in the timetable, they're encouraged by having the activity at home and it being scaffolded to follow all the steps and to see it out and to keep going until it's finished. And that's true for our examples classes, it's true for our laboratories, it's true for all of the activities that we're given. So this is the biggest thing that I think I've learned, is that I think before maybe some people thought that students didn't want to do work when they were at home, but actually scaffolding that work and taking it out the timetable and giving them plenty of time has been my biggest bit of learning from the last 18 months.
And has this been a relatively easy thing to implement? Has been, I mean, I know necessity dictated at the start of lockdown and the pandemic, but is this something that, in your experience, students and staff have almost see as a prerequisite now for learning in these ways?
So if I talk about one aspect of it that has been challenging, it is about the perception again. So I think, again, we had the perception that we'd have to assess that activity to ensure that students were actually doing it. So lots of institutions had a plethora of quizzes suddenly introduced for marks, so assessment of all of these at-home activities to make sure that they were doing it, increased use of the learning analytics. And what we've, I think, found out is that actually students do the work at home if it's value add and if it's useful to them. So while it hasn't been straightforward, because we've had a little bit of re-understanding of students, I think, to do, and building of trust. And I think that echoes lots of people in the pandemic. You know, employers have had to build trust with their employees that they will be doing the work that at home when they're out of sight. And I think it has been the same for us in academia as well. Out of sight, the students, entrusting them to be getting on with doing the work without having to assess it.
Okay, thank you very much. And how's this process looked at Teesside? Has it been a similar program that you've implemented for the subjects that are difficult to teach at home, or have there been any particular challenges that have stayed with you and informed teaching and learning strategy as it exists now?
Alistair, thank you for your question. I think that's a great question. And now I'm going to look at it more from an institutional perspective, so learning and teaching institutionally rather than from a subject specific perspective. And I think for us, we've Teesside's been on a digital transformation journey for a while already prior to the pandemic. So a journey that started in 2016 and 17, where we introduced a range of different digital tools and solutions supported by a really rigorous professional development for staff and students. And so when the pandemic hit, we were very lucky. We had the foundation of digital capabilities and that digital confidence to build on. We found ourselves with about perhaps 6 days of having to pivot some few thousand modules to online, but we were starting from a basis of where staff understood the potential of digital technologies. They understood that there were digital solutions already out there in the university and how to utilize them. What they needed from us as a central team was more around the guidance around learning design and what's different if my student is on campus and I am an expert in teaching my subject matter on campus, how is this going to be different online? And that was where the support and the sort of the investment of time went into. And so what we learned from it, well, I would take sort of 4 lessons from what we learned through the pandemic. First, for any teaching that's done on campus, absolutely a redesign of the learning experience is needed for online or blended. And everywhere you go, there is this, there is this notion that, well, we do this is how we do it on campus. So it could easily be transposed to online, but just putting it onto an online platform. And that is so far from the truth. And we've been on a really brilliant journey of trying to bring academic staff with us on this whole redesign of learning, teaching, and assessments through, digital tools and platforms. So that's the first sort of lesson that's been learned. The second one is the response to the emergency pivot and the learning and the successes and the challenges that we have faced through that is very different to now when you want to design blended learning or online learning or high flex or flipped classroom. There is so much rich experiences we have gained from it, but also that awareness that the emergency response is a very different type of learning experience to actual proper high quality rigorous blended learning. The other thing we've also learned is about this concept of constructivism. So constructivism, as you know, is a very popular, very high impactful learning and teaching pedagogic method. But for it to make sense, to have impact and to have relevance for students, as well as for staff, we need to have a very clearly designed and defined learning path for students that's logical, that's systematic, that allows students to follow a guided process for their learning. And you also need teacher presence. And without the 2 ingredients, constructivism, active learning, whatever the pedagogy is, wouldn't make sense and wouldn't be as impactful. So we've learned that. And finally, what we've learned is any good quality blended or online learning is a collaborative effort across the university. You need your tech systems to work. They need to be maintained. They need to be reliable. You need to have your academics, of course. They are the subject experts. They know how to teach. They know their student needs. But you then need to have your instructional technologists, your learning technologists, or your online learning designers to bring that sort of combination of learning design, instructional learning, those pedagogies. You marry that up with the subject experts who know exactly what the content is, together with robust technology. And so we have found that approach has worked really well for us. So those are the 4 key learning that we've taken away from the pandemic and into the future.
And has it led to a greater proliferation in terms of how different courses are taught by different teachers, particularly if you're putting an onus on students constructing new understandings and knowledge by being taught at a distance and being taught in different ways now?
I think now we have also realized the absolute value of campus learning, so the face-to-face rich collaboration, communication that you could have with peers, but also with, you know, the lecturer, the teaching team and the students. So for us, I think it's all around how we could utilize and maximize that face-to-face class contact time in the most impactful way possible, but also not forgetting technology gives you a whole raft of brilliant experiences. It brings to life interdisciplinary learning. It allows for global collaboration, things that you can't necessarily always do on a face-to-face setting. And so I think what we have, you know, taken away from this is to enhance and make richer our campus experience. We have all these different experiences through technology that we can embed into our classroom, you know, our classroom-based learning. And a piece of work that we have done over the past few months is around the expansion of the learning ecosystem through the introduction of our new VLE, which is having staff you know, come with us on this journey and realize the potential that classroom has, but also a VLE has and the learning tools have in terms of how students learn. And the learning ecosystem doesn't just stop in a classroom or doesn't just stop on a VLE, but actually it's that expansion and that seamless integration of technology that really brings to life really good learning experiences for students. But it also then helps students set their skills in terms of, you know, that seamless use of physical and virtual spaces for the real world. Because that's, you know, in the real world, when you think about Industry 4.0, when you think about fourth industrial revolution and the automation of a lot of work that we do and the skill sets that we need, that's what's required. So we're bringing academic staff on this journey of that expansion of the learning ecosystem, and yeah, being very successful with that.
Great. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I think this is a good time to bring in Laurie, who's joining us from JISC, just to ask what the impact's been on your interactions with the universities that you're working with. I mean, obviously, JISC provides a number of services and works with the sector in lots of different ways, you know, be it from, you know, sort of the nuts and bolts of IT services to digital resources, consulting, advice, procurement. I mean, these areas that Anne's talking about, Laurie, the rise of interdisciplinary learning, you know, the greater facility for global learning, the renewed importance on having the right VLE and other suppliers. Are these all areas that are needing more attention in your experience?
So my area of research is I look at academic practice, I look at student behaviors, and we've been working with both academics and students to identify what's been going on in the pandemic and what's been needed. And I think, you know, listening to both Anne and Claire, you know, two really good examples of success, you know, two things that have really been brilliant. I think it's fair to say that during the pandemic, that's not been consistent across every student and every member of staff. So I've been doing the research to sort of look at what those experiences are. I think there's an awful lot of rhetoric around digital about what it can do. And I think we have to temper that with what students want and what staff are able to do. I want to see more emphasis on bringing staff on that journey, like Anne was saying, how we can design professional development that helps them to really engage with the tools, the services that are out there. You know, it's not about buying new tools. It's not about grabbing, you know, whatever technology is at hand and using it. It's about giving the time and the space for academics to find what works for them and to be able to use it to the most effect. And that goes for students as well. You know, students come to us, you know, at maybe 18 years old, you know, with mature students and obviously other students, and we make assumptions about what they do. And one of the things that we do at JISC is we're trying to understand what those needs are. So I guess I'm pushing a more reflective piece about this. I'm trying to say, let's just take a moment and see what we've learned in the pandemic, see what's happened. And, you know, the research that I've been talking with Mark about has really made me think twice about what we say about using digital. So, for example, we saw in a lot of institutions the BAME attainment gap or awarding gap, I prefer awarding gap, actually shrink. So we actually saw BAME students level up during the pandemic. And I'd like to know why that's happening. And it might be that it's digital, but it might be flexibility of assessment, or it might be that they have more time. not on campus. So what's going on with that? And it's not just the BAME students that narrowed that gap. It's also disabled students and international students as well in some institutions. So again, is that happening across the board? I'd love to know what's happening in other institutions with regards to those awarding gaps as it changed. And as we come out of the pandemic now, I'm really interested to know what happens to that awarding gap. Will it widen again? And if it does widen again, we need to then look at what was going on during the pandemic and look at those practices, look at digital practices. Were there things that we were doing that were really effective? And if they are really effective, we need to rethink what we're going to do going forward, I think.
And how does the time pressure to deliver this effectively impact on institutions, do you think? Because it's like I say, it's great to see some gap shortening and taking some positives from what is a very testing situation and what, where students and staff have been put under a lot of pressure, but the need to go back to perhaps a traditional academic year with assessment cycles and everything else. Is it important that these gains are protected, and is there a way that you can really do that other than sort of paying close attention and developing more feedback loops?
We've done several hundred hours of interviews with academics and with students, and the one thing that happened this was what, 560 days ago, March last year. Let's remember how long ago this was. And it's not over yet either. So when that happened, we started interviewing academics in April, and the levels of stress that they were experiencing were enormous. There were academics that had never taught online before, just sort of coping. And we interviewed those students. We interviewed those staff. We also interviewed students at the same time about their experiences, and they hadn't experienced that distance learning. As the pandemic's progressed, I think people have started to develop those practices and understand them. Do we protect the gains? I'm not sure that we can protect everything that's happened, because as we all know, the media have been pushing this rhetoric around value for money and being back on campus. And yet I'm sure that Anne and Claire and many anybody that's teaching that's come into the session will know that it probably takes at least as much effort to prepare for online learning, if not more. And the energy and the things that you get as feedback don't happen in the same way. So we need to think about what that looks like going forward. Online learning is not a cheap option. It's not an easy option, but it might be a really good option for leveling up. It might be a really good option for really closing some of these gaps in terms of inclusivity, in terms of poverty and things like that. But we need to get it right. I don't know what those gains are going to look like at the moment. We're still doing the research, as I'm sure many other institutions are as well. And, we'd be happy to work with institutions to do that. But it's this is not something we can look at and say, oh, these were the quick wins, let's keep them. This is something we really need to reflect on and get right.
Okay. Thank you, Laurie. Mark, I think this is a good point to bring you in. I mean, Adobe have had a long-standing interest in things like, digital literacy, digital skills, looking at the importance of project-based learning and group learning, and how digital education can facilitate all of that to a better degree. In many ways, you've perhaps just had a lot of things confirmed to you in the past 18 months based on, how you've been working with universities for a long time now. But when it comes to still analysing those gaps and analysing the pain points, but also where things have gone right for universities, does what's been discussed so far echo with the conversations that you've had with your university partners?
Yeah, totally. And, I'm coming to this conversation having worked at an institution at the start of the pandemic and going through this pivot to online and to blended, and seeing it from an observation where we had programs before the pandemic that were designed as blended programs with a kind of a resilient pedagogy, that when we had to switch the lecture-based to Zoom sessions, all the other activities and the threads and the narratives kind of transition, and they had an easier transition over with the student expectations, versus others that had to really kind of pivot very quickly. So I'm coming from that perspective. And I think it's worth acknowledging as well that blended learning obviously isn't a new concept. The whole idea of blended is something that the OU, for example, have done for many, many years before the internet and things. But I think what we're seeing and what I'm really excited about is how technology now can facilitate that next, if you like, that next generation of blended learning and how that might look at an institution. And I think Claire and Anne have really pointed out, I think, some of those key tenets and advantages of blended learning in terms of the idea of promoting student agency and time, so that the idea that they've been set activities and it's down to the students to work out how they complete it, how long, some will do it really quickly, some will take longer, some will want to go deeper. And so there's that kind of personalization, that scaffolding of activities and narrative that's so important in good course design. And I think when Laurie's talking there about, we know online courses and learning design courses do take longer because of that thought that's really given to how the activities weave in together, but the results can be hopefully a lot more productive, both for the academics, rewarding for the academics, and also more rewarding for the students as well. And the idea that for blended learning to work, we've got to be designing activities that build on that intrinsic motivation of the students. So designing activities that are usually situated in a real world example. And so one example of that we've seen over the pandemic, you asked me for some examples, Alistair, is, for example, an institution in Australia that we work with, Swinburne, who through the pandemic found it wanted to support their teaching students, their education students, who were going into schools or were trying to teach remotely, teach training. And how could they support them? So they came up with a podcast series on talking through some of the topical issues that students might encounter as they're dealing and teaching during a pandemic. And that grew and grew with students then having their own episodes on that. And so it became this kind of community of practice. So we've seen those kind of examples happening, but then we've also seen other examples of faculty who've really use their creativity to design really neat and interesting ways of delivering resources, to replace many assessments that become more project-based and more authentic assessments being designed. And all of these things do take more time to set up, but hopefully once they're set up, it does mean that they're going to get more reward and more worth out of them over the coming years. I think another benefit that Claire mentioned as well, or maybe you have, around the feedback loops, that I think as we start to integrate more technology into this, we start to get more feedback loops, and we start to really recognize the value, as Anne mentioned, of those kind of face-to-face sessions. So rather than us thinking predominantly about the face-to-face environment when we're designing programs, we're thinking about the student's holistic environment. And I wonder if it's that kind of thing that's actually helped with the attainment gap closure, perhaps, is actually we're thinking more holistically about the students and more intentionally thinking about the whole program design. And so I think that's the key word to me, is intentional, when we do this.
Okay. And have you seen any disparity in the attitudes towards, or the take up of, or the execution between STEM and HSS subjects?
Not really, no, because I think, if we think about every student, no matter their specialism, has to know how to communicate what they're learning. Ultimately, as they're learning, we're looking at outputting graduates who are able to create new ideas, new thinking, and to be able to communicate that. And so what we're seeing is the application of our platforms across all of those subjects, because whether you're a STEM student, a humanities student, you need to be able to communicate what you're doing, and you need to be able to communicate your thinking. And so what we're seeing through digital literacy is Creative Cloud being an enabler to students to being able to showcase that work, or for academics to be able to communicate that knowledge. And that's really kind of agnostic across all subjects.
Okay. And to Anne's earlier point about sort of championing constructivism, does a cloud-based program, do you find it gives students a level of autonomy in the way to work and present their work in different ways that they're generally enthusiastic about? Mark, sorry, that was all.
Sorry. Yes, I think so, because I think it comes down to that agency piece again, in that traditionally we ask students maybe to create a report in quite a lot of subjects, but I think by enabling students to say, choose the medium that's going to fit the audience they're presenting to, fits the areas where they have an interest in, they're more intrinsically motivated to then go and develop that subject. And what we find that content, and what we find that when we could situate assignments within a real world context with an audience, so an audience you're going to present that work to, you're starting to create more authentic assessments, and you're starting to get the students thinking about their problems or their subjects in a different way. In a slightly different way, last week I attended an event with Oxford University through a program called Oxco, where they had some doctoral students and some academics creating videos of their research. And I think by doing this, they've taken their research and created videos to kind of explain the research. They'd started to look at their research in a new way as they thought about, well, who's the audience that my research, that these videos are for? So some of them were designing them for YouTube generation, for students to really understand, others for another academic audience, and some of them for a broader public audience. And just that fact just helped to change the way they thought about their research and the way they presented that research. And we saw similar with engineering students as well, as they were sharing some new novel ideas for eco-technology by creating kind of digital artifacts that showcase these ideas through video, through illustration, through animations. They were able to communicate those ideas in new ways and get new ways of feedback of those ideas as well.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Claire, I'd like to come to you just to that point about STEM education, because I think it's more and more pressure is being piled on universities to create employable graduates, and there's a question of the employability skills and what do those actually translate as, and what do they mean, and how do you teach them? Have you seen an appetite in your students to be assessed in different ways, or to have the kind of learning communities crop up that Mark's talking about with, you know, interactive podcasts and so on?
Yeah, this is interesting, because I think that is a really long-term area of transformation, which I have until now not considered how potentially it was accelerated by last year. So I think we were already moving into, you know, creating videos, video pitches to talk about your work, rather than maybe making a poster, you know, lab reports being replaced by oral kind of tests and things. But the employability skills that we know are very, very oral based. So I think the online assessments and the way that we're doing things now has really accelerated the ability to think about oral skills and oratory skills in students. So, you know, they're not necessarily needing to write down their answers or write really long reports, but to have really authentic assessment and efficient assessment that you're talking about. And I think what is interesting for us to be looking at is how have assessment centres changed. So in terms of graduates, when they're looking for roles and they go to big assessment centres, how did they adapt to the pandemic situation? Because some of our assessments have been authentically based on the type of skills that graduates would need to demonstrate in those big assessment centres. And when I worked in industry, I used to run those assessment centres. So I used to enjoy kind of watching students try out the activities. And, you know, they've had to change because of the pandemic. And what are graduate companies going to take and keep of those changes? And how will that then impact how we're trying to get students to develop those skills as well? So I think this is a really nice loop that we're looking at, where there's been shifts in one place and we're having to shift in response.
Do you think that by its nature, authentic assessment now in the modern era is just becomes more collaborative, because you need these different formats, or you're testing people in such different ways that perhaps you weren't, you know, even 2 or 5 years ago?
So I'm not sure on the answer to that. So you said become more collaborative. How do you think that assessments come more collaborative? I think we always have, especially for engineering, we always have to do this demonstration of individual competency. So one of our requirements for professional development is that students have to demonstrate individually that they've achieved something. And this is always quite difficult actually to do in terms of group projects and things. But I think what it's done is changed a little bit the hierarchies of how we do that. So rather than in the past, you might have had a student who'd taken on the leader position and other students who'd followed. What we've been able to do is say, look, there's lots of different ways of being included in group, and we've learned that through these digital skills. And then it's not just about how much you talk, and your contribution isn't vocal, and especially this is true for kind of female students as well, but your contributions are both technical and non-technical. And a really interesting question to me is, should we be letting students now graduate with a first who are purely technical and don't have this rounded skill set of inclusion and been able to work in the digital space collaboratively and inclusively? And I think it's interesting to look at how that might be reflected in assessment. Yeah,
absolutely. And if I could ask you about that, just as it's again not an easy question to answer, but this makes assessing a lot more complex, doesn't it? Especially if you are taking a student-centered approach, because there are many different types of students and many different types of work that Claire touched on in her answer.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think assessments is one of those trickier parts of the learning and teaching academic journey when you're thinking about whether it's a pivot or whether you're moving from a campus-based model to a high flex model or blended or fully online model. What do you do with the assessments part of it? Now, I think technology allows us to design courses and design learning experiences that are outcomes focused, that's goal oriented, and then you could map your assessments onto that kind of strategy. Now, for us, I think we did a lot of work during the pandemic around flexible assessments and looking at how do you take something that, as Claire's already touched on, how do you take something that is predominantly delivered on a face-to-face basis, such as, let's take with legal education, mock trials, advocacy, cross-examination, those sorts of things, but also labs and fashion type courses that require practical elements. What can you do to help students demonstrate both the knowledge, the skills, and the learning outcomes for those courses or for those modules, but in a different way, because they couldn't necessarily be in the same space, collaborating, etc. And technology allows you to do very many things. If you understand, I suppose, the affordances, also the limitations of different pieces of technology, and create a learning experience through that and help assess students through the learning journey that they have had, I think technology allows you to do quite far-reaching things that you can do on a face-to-face basis. So several of legal education providers across the UK, for example, had no other options but to pivot their advocacy assessments or client negotiation assessments to online. But actually technology allows you to assess the skills, the knowledge, the competencies that's required, but perhaps in a slightly different way. And again, I would say that, with how technology is evolving and impacting and transforming various professions, whether that's the legal profession or engineering or any of the other professions, then there is something we as educators have a responsibility for in terms of preparing students for that change, in preparing students to thrive in an automated society, and actually assessing students through the use of digital forms can enable and prepare students to thrive in that kind of changing environment. So I've taken a very broad approach and given you a bit of a legal education example, but I think, with assessments, I think most institutions are grappling with this issue. And I think really assessments need to be flexible, they need to be inclusive, and they need to be authentic, and technology allows you to do that. The other thing is, one of the earlier when I was saying a few words, I touched on this interdisciplinary aspect. Now, it's in a campus-based, face-to-face experience. It's very hard to timetable interdisciplinary collaboration and interdisciplinary teams coming together. So it could be a group of law students working with games design students, for example. So, or business students working with psychology students. It's very hard to timetable these class sessions, but with technology, it allows you to do that. It frees up the space, but it allows collaboration for an interdisciplinary setting. Again, interdisciplinary, whether it's within assessments, whether it's within learning and teaching, or just the learning process and the learning journey for students, is again another vital compartment of, where education is going, and blended online learning offers that opportunity.
Thank you, Anne. Mark, sorry, I was going to come to you next, but please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that through, and and I think the assessment piece, not to get too philosophical, but I think some of this is about what we see as the purpose of assessment. Now, obviously, we have assessment for getting our degrees and getting professional accreditation for subjects. But a piece of work that we've been doing with TESAL, or we're looking at TESAL, is on assessment, on creativity within assessment, and that notion of assessment for learning. Because ultimately, I guess if we go from a viewpoint that we want assessments to be an opportunity for students to showcase their knowledge, what they know, and to showcase these skills they're developing, then I think blended learning can really help there in terms of, to Claire's point earlier on about scaffolding. Now, if we scaffold authentic assessment, project-based assessments through the modules, you can then use chunking to bring in those different elements of collaboration. And so if you like, in the grading, you can break apart some of those elements. So some of those parts will be formative, and will be, you know, things that students themselves will take away and showcase in their own way. And some of those will go towards their grading. And I think that's part of the work of the synchronous part of blended learning is that space and that time for students to go and develop that aspect of the assessments. And so that's something that we see. And when we have a teacher community, and on there we have lots of learning and teacher resources called the Adobe Education Exchange. And this has activities that are kind of sequenced a bit like that enable that kind of scaffolding of skills, knowledge, and behaviours to then produce artifacts. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
No, I mean, I thanks, Mark. I mean, we've got quite a few questions queued up already. There's over 200 people in the room today, so thank you all very much for joining us. One question I wanted to put to the panel in general, and I mean, I don't know, Laurie, if this ties into some of the interviews and research that you've been doing, is it's from Mike Wallace. Is how can institutions satisfy both the students and staff who prefer or require to learn and teach online, and those who prefer to do it as part of a large class, or for whom some coming into the classroom is very difficult. This is a problem that's never going to be solved entirely, because you've got two diametrically opposing views. But Laurie, is there anything, or are there any compromises you think we can make that can kind of keep everyone happy to an extent?
How do we meet all the needs and please all the people, you mean?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I think that should be our main focus. We can't, you know, I think Mike, I did respond to Mike in the chat. Mike's right, and he's got a lot of experience. I know Mike, he's done a lot of work and written a lot of stuff on this. We can't, but what we should do is start by saying, what are we trying to do? You know, what are we trying to do with our learning? How are we going to design it for those students? And controversial. Sometimes students might want to do something. That doesn't mean to say that it's good for them, you know? So you might think that being in a lecture is good for you. It's not necessarily the best way to learn. And actually, in the interviews that we've done with students, we've heard a lot of rhetoric about back to campus. We hear that a lot. We see it in the media, back to campus this, back to campus that, value for money, which was another question in the chat. When we interviewed students, they didn't necessarily mean back to lectures. In fact, rarely did we hear students, when we talk about back to campus, say, yes, I'm desperate to get back into a lecture people with 300 other people. And lectures aren't necessarily inclusive. When we talk to lecturers, for example, you know, it's how do you engage 400 people, you know, 100 people? It's very difficult. And how do you do it in an hour? You know, there's no way that you're going to engage with every single student in an hour doing that. So I think we need to look at the learning design. There are tools as well for doing this. You know, I think Mike was referring to HighFlex in the chat. You know, when we've got students coming in from home and students that are in situ. So there are tools that are doing it. JISC's working on a system at the moment, virtual classroom system, that we're trialing in a few places, and that seems to be good. But then we've got to sort of think about the cognitive load of the technology on the lecturer. So the lecturer is also having to operate all these systems as well as delivering the content. And I think we need to start thinking about, well, what's the most effective way for that particular content? And the thing that I hear most from students isn't actually about content. I mean, does content really matter that much now? You know, education is about engagement and connecting to others. That's how I feel about it. You know, even assessment, it's all about engaging with something. And I think that's what we need to focus on. We need to focus on systems and tools and processes and learning designs that allow for greater experience of engagement and working together and engaging with the content, but not about transmission of content. You know, I mean, surely that's something we've broken now.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. Claire, I'd like to come to the point that Laurie raised about workload for staff, speaking to somebody who was literally teaching before you joined us today for this discussion. Do you think there's enough being done to assess what is a reasonable amount for educators to do now in terms of both, you know, sort of adapting their courses for in-person and online, and is there more requirement for engagement when you migrate something to digital? Does it get rid of some barriers that were previously in place that perhaps made it easier to plan, deliver, and assess students?
Yeah, this is obviously something as somebody in a kind of leadership position that I really worry about, actually. So the kind of load, and there are all sorts of loads for an academic. So there's the general how many hours you're putting into designing something, of course, but there's also the kind of emotional load. So sometimes you have the experience as an academic when you're trying to do a session where you are the responsible for the energy in a room. And I remember, I say to lots of quite junior academics, you're not responsible for the energy in a room. It is not, you don't have to give all of yourself out in order to develop a good student experience. And because of the focus on student experience and when we watch TED Talks and we see these really engaging speakers, I think there's a huge emotional load and mental load for academics trying to make themselves into TED Talkers, which is not what the kind of students potentially need. It's a really interesting idea, this thing that what students want versus what they need. And now considering the kind of emotional load, what really I have honed down that I think students do want is availability of their lecturers. So in some places, I guess the blended by design approach has been that the lecturer will stay online, available through this online TED Talk type video that they've produced. And all of your on-campus teaching is then going to be led by people who aren't your lecturer. And how do we do flipped learning and problem-based learning, where we want the lecturer to be available and the academics to be available to students without having to have them available for repeated or infinitely repeated sessions? So I think the area of workload that I'm really wondering about, so the kind of emotional workload, but also this availability workload. So how do we value add, a trite term, but where is the best value add for an academic to be that really is going to build relationship and confidence in the students? And how do we then use our teaching fellows and technicians and students in their own groups to actually have learning as well? And some of that is about shifting some of the workload in terms of the energy, but also in terms of the preparation, I guess, back onto students. So some of what I said about this scaffolding and relying on students and trusting them to do the work, you can, in truly flipped, if you can trust the students to have done the work beforehand, you can shift a lot of the workload back on the students in terms of the availability and preparation, and really focus the lecture on being the kind of learning that you need. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yes. It's not an easy one to answer, definitely. Laurie, yes, sorry, you'd like to respond?
Yeah, just to come back on what Claire was saying about lecturers being more available and answering. When we interviewed third years during the pandemic, so these are students who have had experience of pre-pandemic campus life, they were saying things to us like, my lecturers are more available to me now, they're more responsive. And that's through the digital media. Most often it's through email or Teams, but they were saying about how lecturers were more responsive than on campus. And it might just be that when they were on campus, they didn't think to use the digital media to get in touch, and they would go and hope to bump into them in corridors or knock on the door and things like that. But with this extra expectation comes extra load on individuals. And I do worry about that. One of the things that our research showed us as well is that this, independent of what their lecturers were or what the subject was, we found that there was a gender bias in that kind of, I want to ask a quick question, pastoral type work. It fell to young women more than young male academics to sort of take on that pastoral role with students, especially during the pandemic. I mean, and it probably isn't a surprise to Anne or Claire that happens. But I think that it became really obvious during the pandemic, that extra load. And so I worry about things like that as well. Yes, we can be more responsive through digital, but with that comes a lot of cognitive load.
Okay, thanks, Tori. Mark, you mentioned earlier about the exchange that Adobe has online for sort of exchanging ideas and allowing a learning community to flourish in that way. Is it perhaps a case of it's not easy to crack again, but to using digital platforms in the right way to really sort of try and minimize the load on people and take a lot of the, if you create a better central resource, can you design something online, that reduces load over the long term, do you think?
I think there's so what we're finding is obviously through the pandemic, and I think coming out of the pandemic, we're seeing more kind of co-design and more co-design and more support. So more co-design amongst, I think Anne mentioned, across different academic specialties, support specialties, IT, to kind of bring that together. So, but I think that has to be a strategy. It's really difficult if people are doing that ad hoc within departments, and that needs to be an institutional strategy. And also increasingly bringing in students to support that as well. So we have a program that runs in many universities around called Adobe Digital Literacy Champions, where students will support other students in their acquisition of digital skills, or will help faculty. And we'll run workshops that are quite agnostic. We then, as you mentioned, have the Adobe Education Exchange, which is predominantly a faculty resource, which has lesson plans and outlines that can be adopted. And what we are finding is with Creative Cloud having that wide plethora of digital medium that students can use, and is a consistent tool across everything, it means that you're only, when you're sharing resources or sharing how-tos, you only need to share that once, and the students will build that capability up. There's obviously lots of videos out there as well on how to do particular things on the various tools and platforms. And so we're finding that students will, again, if they've got the intrinsic motivation to develop that artifact or to share that knowledge, they will acquire the skills they need to do that. And I guess as a student, Laurie, in a different way with his pastime, has picked up some of those skills as well, to kind of pick up how to get creative with various tools. I know what the output is I want to create. I'm now going to pick up the building blocks myself on how to do that. And I think what we're finding with Creative Cloud is it's that enabler that can enable those things to happen, and it shouldn't add an extra weight to faculty time, particularly beyond integrating and designing activities and assessments that enable students to engage in that way.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. And would you like to respond to Mark? We have something to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alistair. Mark, thank you for that. And actually, one of the things when Mark was speaking, when the question about assessments came my way, one of the things I should have said was around this big focus around digital literacies. Digital literacies is, can be classed as a buzzword, and there's a lot of work currently going on around what does digital literacy actually mean, and just has a brilliant framework around it. At TSAD, we're doing some work around digital literacies, confidence and fluency, and sort of mapping out a pathway for staff and students in terms of the journey people could take to develop those skill sets. But assessments play a real vital role in terms of students building on their digital literacies, and that means different things to different subject disciplines. It means different things to different professional bodies. And so this concept of digital literacies and the use of flexible, inclusive, authentic assessments have a place to play in terms of how we redesign learning experiences, but also assessments to go with it. It's a real passionate topic of mine, the whole concept around digital literacies and what it means, particularly around in legal education. But that's for another day. But I just wanted to say, I think when you think about technology and its affordances to its assessments, I think well-designed assessments will allow students to build and develop their digital literacies in whatever the context it would be for their discipline area.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left. I just want to try and get through as many of the questions that we've had from the audience as possible. We've had a few questions about addressing digital poverty and how it's been quite difficult during this period. Claire and Laurie, you both responded in the chat, but just in case anyone missed it, Claire, you spoke right at the top of the hour about the kits that have been sent out and the way that you're scaffolding particular courses and enabling students to work in that way. What challenges persist to your mind? What challenges will persist? Is it challenges around the access to space as much as the access to devices is still a problem?
Yes, I absolutely think access to space, the ability to turn your camera on, this was immediately apparent right at the start of the pandemic, that the ability to turn your camera on and having your camera on automatically showing your context. And unusually, I guess, from an engineering department, we've been doing quite a bit of work about positionality with our students. So, what is your positionality? What is your context, your social context, your racial context, your class context? And how does this impact how you're going to approach any collaborative work that we do. And the other thing in terms of that is, okay, so students don't have a quiet space, and that all that's done is, that was true anyway. They didn't have a quiet space to do their work at home, and they didn't have a quiet space to do their learning or their reflection activities. And whether or not they are attending a lecture at the time as well, that's not going to change it. We can move all lectures back on campus, and they're still going to have work to do outside of lectures at home. So I think for me, this is a critical part, I guess, of coming back onto campus, is not for the opportunity to as much to be in lectures or in workshops or labs, but actually to be in a learning space, and be in a safe learning space. And for our students who come from care, and our students who are displaced students, we're a refugee sponsoring institution, having a safe space to learn, where learning is the whole point of it, is really important. And I think that's why we're quite happy to be welcoming students back, really.
Okay, thank you. And Anne, I was wondering, how have these challenges being addressed at Teesside? Are they similar to the ones that Claire's describing?
That's right. Yes, these sorts of challenges. I mean, Claire, you've captured it really well. I mean, the way you support these challenges and you support your learners through the journey is, we have similar challenges, but there are ways, I suppose, that we are all exploring in terms of how we, reduce those barriers to learning.
And Mark, I've previously seen colleagues of yours at Adobe talk about the Spark platform that you have, which has a very sort of minimal digital requirements. It's entirely browser based, I believe. I mean, obviously the constraints of time and devices are something that you can never cure entirely, but are there ways that suppliers such as yourself do have some solutions that help students in those situations?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the Creative Cloud platform is an ecosystem of products and services that work across a range of platforms, from mobile to web to desktop. And I think that's one of the key elements here. And obviously, with it being cloud-based, wherever the student is, whatever device they have access to, they should be able to access their files, and they should be able to be productive and be creating, whether that's creating a video on a mobile phone and editing it on a laptop either on their phone or on a laptop elsewhere, right up to needing, if they're doing high-end video editing on a big workstation. So I think, from a product perspective, our products run on everything from Spark, as you mentioned there, on Chromebooks and on mobile devices, and other apps as well that run similar like that. And also a lot of our collaboration functions as well for the tools will work as well through the web. And that's a big part of what we do.
Okay, thank you. And Laurie, as part of the research that you've been doing, when you mentioned in the chat about the need for sort of structural reform and greater support from government, I mean, do you see any progress taking shape in those areas? Do you think more pressure can be brought to bear at a policy level in order to help with this?
I mean, we talk about digital poverty, but actually we don't mean digital poverty. I mean, we shouldn't. I personally, I don't like using that phrase. What we're really talking about is digital inequity. Not everybody has the same access, not everybody has the same tools and that sort of thing. Poverty is a something that we're struggling with as a society, and we can deal with it. I live just outside of Birmingham, and during the pandemic, I saw homeless people being taken off the streets and given a roof and given food in local hotels. So there is a way of actually ending all sorts of issues around poverty. But we are going to be faced with a whole bunch of students that are struggling financially and struggling, with tools, with space, and all those things. One of the things that some of the students were saying to me about getting back on campus was, as Claire was saying, was about getting back to a space where they can study, getting back to somewhere where they feel that they're not sharing rooms or they're not having to do other things, and get into a student accommodation where they can just be alone and focus. And that's something that it's not something that we can do digitally. There's not a magic. Digital isn't going to fix poverty. and that's something we need to just face up to. Poverty is going to be an issue for us. It's going to be a society issue. It's a government issue. It's not something that every higher education institution can do things with. What I'm really impressed with, and what I've seen during the pandemic, are the lengths that universities go to help students with things like hardship funds. I've seen chief information officers and learning technologies reaching out to students who they know are struggling. Like Coventry University, for example, I know that when the pandemic hit, my wife, who works at Coventry, had to go down and was basically dishing out laptops to students who needed them so that they could actually carry on with their PhDs, because they didn't have them at home. They rely on things like the library, the university library, the computer labs, all of these things. And so that's what we're faced with when it comes to poverty. Not, we can't design things that are just going to alleviate poverty. It needs to be more structural than that. Sorry, that's a bit of a rant on
that's fine.
You see it every day, and you wish you could do something about it, and you can't. And this panel and the people in these rooms, we see it every day, and we wish that we could do things, but I just don't think as higher education we can. All we can do is try and help.
Okay, that's absolutely fair enough. Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I just there's a couple of other topics that we aren't going to have time to talk about, unfortunately. But what I did want to ask the panel was, moving back to that theme of what universities can control and what data is useful to them, is the question of data analytics, which is a huge topic in and of itself, but whether there have been any particular data metrics that have proved useful to the panel for looking at how to take a more student-centered approach, looking at how to implement blended learning effectively. If they're really, Laurie spoke about sort of a few gaps being closed in the research that JISC has done. Claire, and I was wondering, are there any particular findings or data points that you've been able to gather that you have found really helpful and that you think will be helpful in future? Claire,
I can speak to this a little bit. Yes, so one of the things we've been trying to do is do a bit of a workload modeler, like a student tariff for a workload model. So they do this quite a lot in the US. They have tools by which you enter, I want them to read this many pages every week, I want them to watch this many videos, listen to this podcast, and it adds it up and it gives you your student workload on a weekly basis. And we've been moving towards this and enabled by a bit of learning analytics to say, well, when we put up a video that's 10 minutes long, we can look and see, well, how long are students actually spending watching that video? And we can do the same thing with how long is a quiz open for, and we can see from the logs exactly how long students are spending doing different activities, where they're pausing in the lecture, how long it's taking them to engage in lecturing materials and reading materials. And I think it's given us a bit more data to use to do this workload planning. And I think if I'm thinking about blended by design going forwards, it is about this program level design. So not looking at individual modules, but during a week or during a semester or a term, like what is it that a student's doing and where does that workload fall? Because I think that's the way that we can improve inclusion and gain for different kinds of students, is to really understand how much access to workload students have. So depending on your situation, you will have different amounts of access to time to do that work. And a philosophical question that I'm looking at is, should it just be that the harder you work, the better you do? We're rewarding hard work, and what's the mental health implication of that? And the data analytics, we've started using that, and I think we will continue to use that to basically crowdsource workload tariffs for students going forwards.
Okay, thank you. That's an interesting point about whether you can become too preoccupied with data points and whether this could lead to exactly the kind of student and staff burnout that you're hoping to avoid by sort of personalizing learning and making it more flexible. And we've got about 1 minute left, I'm afraid. But I was wondering if there was any particular points like the ones that Claire mentioned that you found that have been useful.
I'll be quick. I think for us, it's all about maximizing the students' chances of succeeding. We've got a code of practice for learner analytics, and it's really to strengthen that partnership between staff and students, but also to allow students the opportunity to take, I suppose, the responsibility for their learning and to seek out support, but also it gives us data points to see where students may be struggling. So this whole thing about achievement, progress, retention, and engagement are all key elements that feed into it. But that's a whole webinar around, you know, learner analytics, and there's lots to say. But you know, and we've got a variety of transparency measures and data points in terms of what we collect to determine analytics and so on. But yeah, I've completely run out of time, but that is a really valid, you know, question that's come up around analytics.
Okay, great. I'm sure we can get another webinar out of that in due course, but unfortunately that puts us time. But thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank you to our panel, Mark, Laurie, Claire, and Anne. I appreciate you taking the time and sharing your insights with us. We hope that you found it useful in the audience. It's great to have so many of you with us. There will be an on-demand version of this webinar on the THE website, along with a summary article that will make clear the key takeaways from it. This will be sent to everyone who's registered, and you're welcome to share it among your colleagues or rewatch it as is useful to you. But so that's all we've got time for today. We hope to be able to engage with you at future THE webinars. Thank you all very much for joining us, and goodbye.